Alrighty, so last but certainly not least, we have Nisha Patel, who is going to do a spoken word performance, Dreaming Disabled Futures. And I have a bio written for Nisha here, but I just want to talk a little bit about her previous involvement with Obliquity. So actually in our first year back in 2019, when we first started off things, Nisha was one of our first workshop speakers, and she led a session called Writing Truthfully with Nisha Patel. And it was the first time that I actually got connected as a medical student who had moved from Calgary to Edmonton for medical school, where I got connected with the arts community in Edmonton. And Nisha also used to run the Edmonton Poetry Festival, and since then has done an incredible range of work. You'll see also some of her pieces outside in the walking gallery. So I am again so honored that we were able to continue this relationship and to see all of the incredible things that Nisha has done in the last 4 years. I will hand it over to you to take over.
I'm gonna tell you a little bit kind of about myself, the way that I see my own relationality to disability and disability futurism. I'll share some poems throughout, and then Nisha, if you could give me like a 10-minute warning for when we would like to end now with our new schedule.
Yeah, you could.
Okay, awesome. All right, so my name is Nisha. I grew up in the woods. I live now kind of behind White Ave, walking distance from one of the best emergency rooms in the country, the U of A hospital. It was very convenient. And for a lot of the first part of my life, I was actually really interested in governance. So like literal politics. I didn't say governance because that can mean anything. And so I went to business school. I focused on political science and nonprofit management and leadership and like all these fancy buzzwords that sometimes don't mean anything. And then I actually did work in politics for almost 3 years. I interned for 28 months because that's what you do in politics, straight out of school. And I experienced a lot of varying, like mostly mental illness at that time. And politics was like this way to like hide the fact that I was constantly like hypomanic with my bipolar disorder. And if you were sad, you were like, man, things are really rough in Alberta. And so it was like, it was a really convenient place for me to be, until I ended up again, like in this position where there was a gap in the continuity of my care. And I ended up being hospitalized in the psych ward at Greynuns Hospital, the same place I was born. So that for me, like as a poet, is very poetic. During that period, when I left university, I had come to poetry. I had really loved poetry slam, which is the competitive side of putting your emotions on the table and hoping that people in the audience are not too drunk to give you a good score so that maybe you win money, but mostly you win honor. And in this like weird space where I had left university, a lot of us lose that crowd. We lose seeing people every day. We lose that really direct community. Everything becomes a scheduled meetup after that. I was in this like flux. I was a competitive debater for 8 years, and suddenly that fell away. And poetry became this thing. I met Majine around that time. I met other poets in the city. I actually competed in like across Canada. I've been to the London Poetry Slam performing and stuff like that. And it became this part of my life that I was trying to achieve the same goal that I had wanted to in politics, which was to try and impact individual lives. And for me, as someone who had believed in small government, not in the political sense, but in the sense that, you know, you're close to a counselor, you're close to the people who pick up your trash, you're close to the waste management, you're close to the people fixing your roads. I feel like poetry is still a way to do that. It's still a way to impact an individual life. And my goal is always to impact those outside of me, but sometimes even if at the end of the day it only impacts me, I consider that a success. Where I started to adopt the label of disability, because I think for many years there was a period where mental illness was like this big, sexy topic for people to take on, right? There was a lot of funding for these initiatives, especially youth initiatives. I should say, like, I don't think all mental health care should be led by 21-year-olds or even 25-year-olds, the average age of onset for bipolar 2 disorder. But we are an important part of the puzzle. And so I had like thrown myself into a lot of mental health advocacy only for those illnesses to never go away, right? They don't get cured, which is fine. I don't believe in a curative model. But then later, right before the pandemic, I was doing what ended up being like my last in-person national poetry tour. After I had been hospitalized, I'd gone right into the arts, never looked back, and I ended up contracting pneumonia. I believe it was on a 12-hour overnight Greyhound that I took from Windsor, Ontario, which is basically Canadian Detroit, all the way to Peterborough. And so that's what I blame. And it ended up being like this very life-changing pneumonia. And so although I had been overweight, I was still in pretty good health. And it was just like this crippling thing that happened to me. And like, even since then, like the lung capacity has never returned, even with like lung capacity tests, which are so fun, coming back normal, which is not to say that I hold any resentment to any practitioner who has done the testing. And that happened like 2 months before the pandemic. So I was already stuck in my house. I was already kind of in this space, which again is still a privilege because there's a lot of disabled people who are stuck in even more ways than I was. And so it became something that had already colored my experience of going into a pandemic. And then a few months into the pandemic, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which of course runs in South Asian populations quite high. It ran in my family entirely on my father's side. And again, like in South Asian culture, this is a fat person disease. This is a disease of mismanaging your body, right? And at the point at which you reach the ER, the damage has kind of already been done, right? Like, this is why hospitals as the first touch point of care can sometimes fail people, right? It's why people like Majin are turned away. It's why we can't deal with long-term pain all the time. And it was like a very strange experience because this was very early in 2020 into the pandemic. Hospitals were really scary places. We didn't know almost anything about it. And it ended up being terrifying for me. But my father, who is diabetic, and my mother-in-law, who is diabetic, and my father-in-law, who were diabetic, ended up like forming this like coalition of, let me give you advice, doctor, 20 years ago. And considering that diabetes has been cured or has been treated with insulin for slightly over 100 years, 20-year-old knowledge is very outdated. You know, the technologies now are incredible. But that was when I realized, like, I am going to call myself disabled. This is something that will not change my body. Diabetic remission almost always, even if you can manage it, does eventually result in a return of type 2 diabetes. And I won't get into the nuances of it as much, but it is like a very humbling experience to realize that fundamentally there is something that cannot be saved in your body. When it comes to insulin production, right? You have a set number of pancreatic cells that produce that insulin. And those are set as a child. And if you lose that function, it doesn't come back yet. And the U of A is also this like incredible place for diabetic research. So my fingers are crossed that if anyone needs like a test subject, I live down the street, so I can do it. I ended up pivoting from working as a festival director. There was no events, so pivot, quitting, fired, like all the same thing. And I ended up going to do a program in cultural studies, which is a big part of the humanities side of medical humanities. And I like really hated theory. I thought I would like really not do well in this program, but it was fully funded, and ironically, it paid better than working in the arts without events for a year. So I honestly did it for the money, which most people don't go to grad school for. And I flew out for half of it. I stayed in Edmonton. And I ended up really falling in love with queer theory, with feminist theories, and with critical disability theory. And so with the history of disability studies, like studies are more like there's able-bodied people who are looking at disabled people. They are observing things. Critical disability was more of a two-way process. It was, we are going to learn from the lived experiences of people who are disabled, and we're going to treat them as knowledge keepers. All of this is, again, still very gray when it comes to people who don't have the same level of cognition that we recognize, right? So when you have people who are nonverbal, when you have people who are considered dependent, who cannot articulate all their thoughts, that is still an area where we do rely on caregivers more than we rely on patients. And I think that's because we don't have all the tools yet, right? And I don't want to prescribe us to saying like, we'll never have the tools to understand a nonverbal person or person with cognitive disabilities. I'm just saying right now, I don't think we always have all the answers. But a lot of the theory taught me that what I thought of as an ideal body was not a concrete concept, right? It was not the thing that would stay the same throughout my lifetime. And through the grief of accepting that my lifestyle had changed very significantly, from everyday things like managing your diet. If you listen to a diabetic diet and the type of counting and the type of measuring you do, for an able-bodied person, you would diagnose them with an eating disorder. But for a diabetic, that's like a natural way of life. The grief and the fatigue that comes with that, the mental toll, that kind of thing, that kind of stuff takes, the fear of going hypoglycemic, which happens so often, which is helped by incredible technologies, right? You have continuous glucose monitors, needles. I'm sure most people know what they are, but needles that you insert under your skin every 10 days, and you can change them out, and it'll tell you what your glucose is at any given time. The history of that kind of technology is that it didn't exist for people like my dad, who have been diabetic since he was 28, ironically, the age that I was diagnosed as well. And so I think there is like this very forward-looking hope that I have that coexists with the grief of losing a lifestyle that I had liked and that I had wanted. Part of that informed a lot of the work that I ended up doing. When you have an endocrine illness, it turns out that blood goes everywhere. And so there's a lot of different systems that end up being affected. And within about a year of the diabetes onset, even with like a controlled blood glucose level, I developed and I'm still experiencing like a very unknown regional pain, symmetrical regional pain in my hands. As a writer, it's really hard to not be able to write. It's really hard not being able to hold my pens or pencils or anything like that. It's even hard to use a keyboard most days. And it's been so incredible to see like how many tests can come back negative. Like there are tests that I didn't even know that you can do. And bouncing from specialist to specialist and waiting and stuff like that is also like both like I think a very humanizing experience, knowing that people are invested in your care, but also can be dehumanizing when you have caregivers or carers or clinicians who don't really believe these things are a problem. It's a different talk to talk about pain as a way we experience the world. That's like a whole other thing. Which is all to say that through the experience of a physically disabled body, I began to experience the world around me differently. I began to see the world around me differently. When my hands could no longer hold my insulin pen or push down on the trigger, or even open those beautiful child-proof locks on your pill containers, my partner became my hands, right? The insulin pen becomes my pancreas. When my ankles swell from, diabetic fluid retention or from diabetic neuropathy, where I don't know where the wounds are, where, I had like a nick on my toe one time and it took 6 months to heal. Like that's such a scary thing, right? All of that changes your relationship to your body and what you think of as your body. There's a really popular theorist in feminist theory, Donna Haraway, who wrote this treatise on the experience of the human body. And it's called the Cyborg Manifesto. And then that concept is essentially that, like, she doesn't want to live in a human body that matches the able body we think of or conceive of all the time. That a techno body or a crypt body that uses science and technology and evolves to be a lot of different things is the future of the human body, right? That these are actually the ways of being human, of augmenting, of, storing up weakness and not trying to move only towards a cure. When I read some of these things, I also read a lot about mass disablement. I read a lot about who gets to be disabled and who doesn't. And another leading feminist theorist, Jasbir Kaur, writes about this too. She has a book called The Right to Maim. And the reality is that the majority of disabled people in the world are not white people. They are people of color. They're Black people, they're Indigenous people, and most of them are in the global majority countries, what we used to call the global South. And the fact that they live there in circumstances that are disabling, those are sometimes caused by social problems. They're caused by social relations. When imperialist governments bomb Syrian children, we are marking them for disablement. And the scale of the bombing means that we don't understand the individualized grief of each of those disabling events. My sister-in-law has a brother who lives in one of our villages in India. He has problems with verbalization, which would have been a thing that would have got support in a Western country. He would have grown up without the cognitive side effects of not having access to this certain type of language. He does not know any sort of Indian Sign Language or ASL or anything like that. And he communicates through his own way. And when she's taken out of that environment as his only caregiver, we have again this idea that certain people are allowed to be disabled, that we're okay with them being disabled in these ways. This happens, I think, in like Western societies too, of course. My father is a laborer. His pain is treated as a routine laboring job. My mother, with her engineering degree, moved to Canada, worked at McDonald's. The scars of like melt in all hot oil. Is the mic going through? It's still green. Okay, you just let me know. And so like, I think we normalize sometimes who is taking on difficult work. When we talk about a disabled community, I also include caregivers. I include the often women of color, Asian women, who do those tasks of like physical care, right? They do the task of taking people to bathrooms. They do the task of cleaning people. They are the ones who work in these long-term care homes more than others. And they are not considered for disability support. So if you are disabled and you require in-home care, that person's cost of living doesn't matter to certain bodies, to the government, to other exclusions. You're nodding because you might have an experience with this. A caregiver doesn't get the same type of disability tax credit. They don't get the same sort of status. And this is also in a society where being on AISH is literally a poverty induced by the government, right? You can't do a certain amount of work. You can't earn a certain amount of money. Is there chaos going out there? Okay. And so all of these things factor into, again, what we think of as disability and what we think of, oh, it's just my partner making a lot of noise. All of these things factor into what we think of as disability and what we think of as able bodies. For those of you who have had to apply to med school or to a program or to a professorship or to almost literally anything that will get you a job or an accolade or access, you've had to use words that reduce who you are to certain categories. For me, those are words like woman, South Asian, disabled, mentally ill, fat. That's one of my favorites lately. I love fat fashion, And there is, I think, a movement where these words can be very powerful for us. And of course, like, you know, right-wing fascists hate that we use these words, but representational words can be very powerful. And for me, reclaiming a word like disabled, which was created in order to distinguish something less than abled, feels like a recapturing of power. It feels like we give meaning and we co-create it together. Some of the works that I have done since, honestly, like, there were so many like videos that came out in those first like 6 months of the pandemic where people kind of went insane. And some people got really good at some stuff, and other people were basically alone for 6 months or more, or even like a year or more because they didn't qualify for early vaccines. I got really into something called visual poetry, which is like when you transform the entire page that the poem is on, or the body or the container of the poem. And I ended up writing this, you'll be familiar with the cover, this chapbook of poetry called Not a Disorder. And most of it is kind of an erasure of the statistical manual of mental disorders. And it was published, it was put out, but honestly, like, it would be like 4 a.m. in my apartment down the street from the U of A. You know, the only time we'd gone out in the last 5 days would have been the Shoppers Drug Mart at 11 p.m. to get my medications. And I was literally just in like a InDesign window, which again, if you're not familiar, is part of the Adobe suite of products that are a total scam. And I was just like creating these things, and I got my hands on an old copy of the DSM-5. I bought a copy of an original recreation of Grey's Anatomy. I was doing like literally like cutting out pictures of like organs, like gluing them places. Some of this stuff is really awful. But I ended up also writing about disability in a way that made me feel empowered and made me feel seen. So this poem is called If the Incredible Hulk Was Disabled. We also had a Marvel phase. We rewatched every Marvel movie twice. So this poem is called If the Incredible Hulk Was Disabled. He would have to fit onto the leather couch as the doctor read out 312.34, intermittent explosive disorder. And he would refuse to accept this, both the rapid onset with no prodromal period, as well as the assumption that his behavior violated societal norms. And he would certainly need more therapy, perhaps group therapy, like I did for 10 weeks. Seated next to the girl who wanted to walk into traffic, I've seen the Hulk walk into traffic without getting in trouble for it. And no one asks him if he's having a bad day. No one asks him if he's on his period when he looks a little green or stressed out or angry. No one sends him to the psych ward against his will or straps him to a gurney like the rest of us, because men are allowed to be angry all the time. Beastly men, men of wit and precarity. I am an episode of my father's anger. I am a flicker in the memories of my mother's wars. When I was a girl, I was angry all the time, my bitten tongue bleeding fury into the energy of the universe, the summation of my limbs, an elongated rage, until I grew into a woman who could be called high functioning, surpassing my potential, dazzling others, feigning normality, which is to say that if I met him now, I would whisper, incredible, huh? That's what they call me. Some of the other things. In a small room, you don't have to do that, but I appreciate it. Some of the other pages in the book like are longer poems, they're more traditional poems. I mentioned before that I really loved being in Poetry Slam. I attended the World Championships in Belgium in September, where I came second last. But I had won the Canadian Championship to get there, so #1 somewhere. And this was the poem that I ended up reading at the championships. And it's called When I Learned That I Am Disabled. And it's about that journey to get to those places. Since then, I've explored like this incredible world of disability art. Once you have the language and the labels, community opens up to you. And for a lot of disabled people who talk about disabled oracles, they talk about crip kinship, right? They talk about care work. There was this concept that really stuck with me, and it's the idea of disability doulas. And so in a society where people are increasingly ill, we have problems that come up, not just because we're testing more, but because our bodies are suffering of climate disaster, they're suffering of illness, they're suffering from food that isn't real food, but tastes like really good sometimes, right? My favorite snack, Hawkins Cheesies, which I'm not convinced is a nutritional source of anything. We're seeing bodies change in ways that we can't keep up with. And this idea that there is a disabled community that can really ease other disabled people into being disabled starts as simply as like the support group theory, right? Support groups are really just people who are acting as disability doulas, but it also gets paired with people who are clinicians and practitioners and also experts in their field who co-create strategies. And we talked a little, I know Majin talks a little about that, so I'm not gonna kind of repeat on that. Some of the work that I work on now when I think of disabled futurism is really borrowing from Afrofuturism movements, which is to say that when I think of who gets to create the future that we're in, I think it should be disabled people, because if you consider society as kind of this circle, marginalized people, disabled people, often people who are disabled are marginalized in other ways as well. There are people of color, there are trans women and stuff like that. They are kind of on the outer edge of this circle. So bear with me. The people on the inside of that circle who experience privileges even within their own marginalizations, those people have the least perspective on what goes on at the outer rim. The people on the outer edge. We've also been watching a lot of Star Wars, so think of the outer rim galaxies. The people on the outer edge, they're the ones who see the most beyond the boundary. In this way, I think of disabled people as the people who can see the future more than the people in the middle, more than able-bodied people alone. In experiencing a total loss of function in my hands for the most part, I received care from the people around me that taught me new types of love. They taught me new ways that people can exchange this reciprocal and sometimes non-reciprocal care. Sometimes you're going to do something called mutual aid, and that person is not going to be able to do it back. You know, sometimes you cook food for people who aren't going to cook you any food back because they can't. And we kind of have to be okay with that. And we don't see it as both magnanimous. We don't see it as like an act of charity, but instead a normal act, an act that occurs in a society that takes care of its weakest. For a lot of that pain, I considered the experience of pain almost like an exchange towards an embodiment of disability that expanded my mind. It allowed me to care for others in new ways, even when they didn't want it. Some of that experience can also be very heavy with grief. It can be very hard to manage. As a writer, I still write, mostly. My photo exhibit out on the inner side of the boards, which is also up in London, very cool. The photo exhibit is really about reclaiming spaces that have not been considered for fat bodies, which is of course a form of disability in many ways. And a lot of my work now really talks about like, how do we center these narratives in a truthful way, even if there are thoughts that are ugly, even if there are moments where you hate your circumstances or hate yourself. I personally would not change the fact that I get to be disabled. I do wish it hurt less sometimes, and I think those things can coexist. So at this point, I've had pain and loss of function for 15 months. I had 3 ultrasounds in the last 10 days, which is not normal. Like, it was just how the scheduling worked. And this poem was written about 7 months into that pain process. 7 months ago, I began experiencing pain in both my hands and wrists, accompanied by a weakness and ongoing loss of fine motor control. Eventually, the pain was so bad, I couldn't hold a pen or carry my own groceries. We ran tests, but came up with nothing we could name. We tested more. We did x-rays, ruled out autoimmune diseases, lupus, MS, carpal tunnel, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. but we know the pain is there, and we don't know why or how. We know it's worse with use. We know finishing my master's, where I typed thousands of words, painstakingly answering emails 16 times slower than normal, alone in a small town in Ontario, made me cry. Last week, my doctor gave up in figuring it out. My hands continue to get worse with use. There's pain management, steroids, which I'm not allowed to take, NSAIDs, which I'm not allowed to take. So I brace my arms all day and pretend it doesn't suck to be a writer who can't hold a pen. So tell me where it all goes down, and I'll meet you there. I'll start the fight. At the intersections of inflamed aortas, we'll offer a sacrifice, like the children offer teddy bears and flowers, at the place that even the doctor, who lasted longer than the 6 doctors before him, gave up. And when the teens give up, it's tragedy. And how can so many things be tragedies in one body when none of them kill you outright? No one wants to know your story if it has no ending. And if you'd have told me to let go of my right hand, I would rather have become a headline. But I've had 7 months now to think about it, and I've changed my mind. I'm willing to seal the deal, or make a pact, or swear an oath, or see the neurologist again, or the rheumatologist again, and the x-ray techs again. Draw the blood 2 days in a row to get all 10 vials, get call after call from 3 different doctors telling me that it could be worse. And I know that too. I know that I'm grateful for what this holy, this worship, this body still is, that it has a heart that beats even without all its platelets and red blood cells and insulin. But my multitudes are crying, sometimes quietly in a windowsill and sometimes loud in the shower when I cannot comb my hair and I'm left to cut out all the matted bits. And I still want this body, every second of it, even when I can't sign for the checks they send me when I talk about it. I think it's funny that some people believe that heaven is just escaping from their body instead of fighting the world to teach yourself how to love it. Thank you. I'm gonna maybe talk a little bit about the photos very quickly. When you create an entire body of work based on being disabled, something fun that I did was requisition copies of every single medical record I had. And you have to pay for that, that's fun. And it was like, I have this huge stack of just like paperwork. I would not recommend getting your psychiatrist's notes, which they are legally allowed to give you, because that is a new way of seeing yourself. And I did not want it afterwards. But it is really cool to get things like x-rays and scans and like dental stuff. I just got some x-rays back yesterday, and like we had to make like, if you're a clinician, but you have to make like the okay sign. And I was like in so much physical pain, but the irony of making an okay sign, like that's been now concretely printed in this x-ray, is just like so funny to me. Like there's humor in that. So some of the photos outside have a few different themes. They were part of an ongoing thing that I'm trying to work on, which is how do we counter the idea that being disabled is a fate worse than death? This particular exhibit mostly takes on recreations of famous pop album covers. And I've placed like sometimes a very naked body, mine, or a very fat body, also mine, into these spaces that are traditionally occupied by very thin, able-bodied people. And I had a lot of fun. I shot it all myself. I developed it all myself. I printed it all myself, all those fun things. Some of the other parts of the series explore concepts like polypharmacy, a dosette that they don't make dosettes big enough for me. So that kind of stuff is fun. Poetry on physical objects. Some of them I've superimposed my x-rays onto a body to try to figure out where these things are. The x-rays, for instance, that come from having pneumonia are both horrifying and really fascinating at the same time. Like the idea that something can grow inside of you that is not good for you, but you can still see it is just incredible to me. And all of that, I think, kind of comes together in, pretty pictures you can put online or on the wall. But really, they are the result of like almost 2 years, I think, of like dedicated study to learning how to believe that my disabled body is worth it. So I'm just going to end there. A lot of my work is available and in progress, but mostly I just hope you take away a deep appreciation for the love that comes from being disabled and how it becomes a way to exist in the world that is valued as worthwhile and worth conserving. Thank you. Yeah, any questions? I can totally. Yeah, so the question for those of you who didn't hear it was, if your practitioner could know that you were going to be reading their notes many years later, perhaps, would you ask them kind of how they would want to rewrite it, or maybe say something different? Yeah, my university psychiatrist was incredible. I called him Owen Wilson. This was a man who had a medical degree. As you know, psychiatry is like one of the ones that takes the longest to study in. Incredibly talented man, who wore like dirty khaki shorts, like mud from him biking to school, sweaty t-shirts because he would come in like 5 minutes late. He had like New Balance, which is apparently now popular again. Yeah, they're coming back. He just had like this, he looked like Owen Wilson, but like a not famous version. And it was so fun being in his sessions, even though I was like, at that point, bipolar was like the biggest thing that I was dealing with. And I was often very insane in these sessions. And, like, I don't think he would change anything because that man wrote like so little down that I was like, were you even there? I was there. I remember things very differently. Whereas like later on, I had a doctor, unfortunately, who did move because of how Alberta has been treating her. And her notes were not something I wanted to see. It was just like, it was often like very dehumanizing in some ways. So I think I've experienced like a great spectrum of care, right? There's been really incredible care. Again, some of the best care that I've ever received is from the university, and it ends when you leave university. So there's huge gap, right? And how that transfers over. Right now, as you know, there's like a family doctor shortage, for instance, and things are happening everywhere in people's bodies, and they can't treat everyone. So they treat everyone a little. And I don't know if that's the best solution, right? Like you come in and you're only allowed to have like one problem at a time. So I think, yeah, like, I don't know if that kind of accountability is really the way forward to change how you're treated at the moment of that contact. I do think that, I was talking to Nisha, who was doing like overnight on call, multiple days in a row. Like that is also not good for a body, right? Like there's got to be better ways that my emergency room doctor is not so sleep deprived that they're going to miss something that kills me. Two of my favorite TV shows of all time are Scrubs and House, which are like both spectrums as well. And my sister is a nurse, my cousin is a nurse, and all my other family are engineers. And I think like there's this devaluing of how we form social bonds with people, which are all the result of pressure from the system. Like I don't often hold it against a doctor that they cannot treat you in 20 minutes, right? Or that they barely write anything down. The x-ray notes are always the funniest. I don't know if you've ever looked at x-ray notes, like in my chart or anything. They're always just like, unremarkable right lung, like normal 7 centimeter this or that. Mass detected, but causes unknown. Like, they're just like, are these even about people? Like, do you even see people? when you look at these charts, and it's so incredible and so funny, but also like there's so much grief in it. So I try to offer grace. I think maybe like my psychiatrist, Owen Wilson, he would probably not say anything different because he is a very strange man. But I do think my current psychiatrist, for instance, who is really pushing for the legalization of psilocybin as a microdose treatment, she has plenty to say. And I think I would look forward to looking at her notes, which thus far I have learned my lesson and have not requisitioned. Do we have questions in London? Oh, okay. Awesome.
Hi, Nisha, it's Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm just curious, we're currently undergoing a case diversification process, really thinking about language and the words that we use. And I was just interested that you chose to use the word fat and chose to say disabled. And I was just curious how you find health professionals respond to that, and what would you recommend to the professionals that deal with you in terms of the choice of language?
Yeah, it's I think it really depends on forming enough of a relationship that you can talk about what labels are comfortable for certain people. I do a lot of speaking now around the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And that itself is a label that not everyone wants. They don't want to be called a person with disabilities. They want to be called a disabled person, right? Their personhood involves their disability. It's part of them. But there are still people who prefer the first. And I think if we accept that language evolves and that it's a product of relationships, we have to invest in the relationship building in order to co-create the labels that work. For me, as a person who grew up fat, and there are a lot of really nasty Gujarati South Asian words for it that I'm not going to repeat, which are sometimes applied lovingly. You know, like the nicknames for children in Gujarati are often their worst flaw, said in a nice tone. For me to reclaim the word fat, for instance, has been joyful. You know, it makes it so that I don't have to fear people using something against me. You know, I feel empowered. It also is like a very useful search function on social media, for instance. You can see people using a common language, and then you can access those online communities, which are very essential to disabled people. I know that fat is a hard word for a lot of people. I know, like, all my aunts and uncles who come from my community don't want to come from my community. I know that the latest in the media miracle weight loss drug Ozempic is teaching people that being fat is bad again, and it's undoing like years of advocacy that you can be healthy or unhealthy, but you shouldn't be treating people poorly because of it. And so I think like these words evolve. Maybe later we won't need labels, right? We won't need these words. We will have better language. So far as I use them now, I find the representational value of them to be advantageous in getting my point across and finding my own humanity.
Thanks, Nisha.
No problem.